Good, I have it. Good evening and welcome to the American Philosophical Society. My name is Michelle McDonald and I am the director of the library and museum here. Before we get to this evening's programs, I just wanted to give you a brief sense of where you are. How many of you have been to the APS before? Oh, most of you. Okay, how many of you have not been to the APS before? That's okay, raise your hand, it's all right. All right, this will be a brief introduction to the APS to help ground you before we start this evening's discussion. And first, I want to start with the land acknowledgement that we use at the beginning of all of our programs. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenapehoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance, and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. So, the American Philosophical Society was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin, one of his many innovations here in Philadelphia. It was intended to be the analog of Royal Societies in London and Paris and other parts of Europe. And I'm always struck when I read the introductory sort of founding documents of the Society that he begins with the first drudgery of settling the colonies, which confines the attention of people to mere necessaries, is now pretty well over. Yeah. In 1743, it might have seemed like it was pretty well over, but of course, he couldn't see into the future as bright as he was. He chose Philadelphia not only because he lived here, but because they thought it was equal distance among the 13 colonies, and so might be a gathering place for those who were interested in natural history and experimentation from all of the colonies. Today, the APS still has a membership, those who are elected for their academic accomplishments, of about 1,000 members. 4/5 of them, 835, reside in the United States, and the others are our international members. They gather twice a year, in April and in November, here in Philadelphia. But we also have numerous library and museum conferences and dozens of special events and lectures like the one in which you are participating this evening. I would be remiss if I did not mention the APS Press, which is, I am told, the longest sustained publishing house in the United States. And our wonderful partnership with the University of Pennsylvania Press, which makes us stronger still, and they are represented in the back of the room this evening. And then we also offer grants that bring people to the American Philosophical Society for research purposes, and those that send them around the world. We offer about 300 grants a year. We have, and here I will move a little more quickly, for those of you who are interested in our collection, about 14 million manuscript pages, over 325,000 books, the papers of 7 Nobel laureates, and an 8th on promise, about 300,000 digital objects, actually many more born digital objects, which is one of the fastest growing aspects of our institution, and then over 3,300 museum objects. These are stewarded by 4 centers. The Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, which is our oldest center. It just celebrated a decade. The Center for Digital Scholarship, the David Center for the American Revolution, and our newest center for the history of science. In addition to what we have in the library, we also have the APS Museum. Now, how many of you have been to the museum at the APS? Excellent. How many of you have been to see Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City? Even better, those of you who have not seen it, you have until December 28th, and then it closes for the year. If you're wondering where it is, it's just catty-corner to us on 5th Street, immediately adjacent to Independence Hall, and I do encourage you to take a look. Finally, if you wonder how we do all of this, it is through the help and support of people like you. If you're interested in learning more about the APS, please do consider looking into our Friends program so that we can put you on the list for future and upcoming events. But now, I'd like to turn to the task at hand. This evening, we are celebrating the publication of a tremendous 3-volume history of Greater Philadelphia. And joining me this evening in the conversation about these works are Charlene Mires, Professor of History at Rutgers University, Camden, and editor-in-chief of the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia. Her books include Independence Hall and American Memory, which is also available from the University of Pennsylvania Press. Howard Gillette, Jr. will also be on the stage and is Professor History Emeritus at Rutgers University Camden and co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia. He is the author of Camden After the Fall and The Paradox of Urban Revitalization, among other works. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. So I have the privilege not only of reviewing these works in advance of this conversation, but also of contributing to one of the volumes. So you have two of the editors and one of the authors speaking tonight. I have a series of questions. My first is, so this recently published series draws heavily on, as I mentioned in this introduction of both of you, the Encyclopedia of Philadelphia. Can you tell me a little bit about the encyclopedia and how it inspired this project?
Yeah, so I'll begin by saying these books are a product of the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia. We really look at them as a legacy project, and we're so excited that we have come to the point of publishing them just on the eve of the 250th anniversary of our country. The Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia has been a long-term ongoing research initiative based at the Mid-Atlantic Regional Center for the Humanities at Rutgers Camden, which Howard was the director of, and then I was the director of, and now we have the next team from March that's here this evening. These books are curated from that digital product and enhanced. So what we looked for were thematic ways that we could make books, and curated from all of those topics. We think 3 really great volumes that can bring a new sort of reading experience and help reveal some of the connections with the knowledge that we have gained in doing that long-term project, the encyclopedia.
So this is kind of unfair because I did not include this question in the notes I sent you in advance, but roughly how many, when did the encyclopedia begin, and roughly how many essays does it currently contain?
Yeah, so the encyclopedia project, and we always get asked, how did it begin? And I'll have an answer, and then Howard may have a different answer. The project itself goes back to really 2007. We, in that year, met several of us who were involved at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania with the journal published there, realized we were coming up on the 25th anniversary of the 300-year history of Philadelphia, which was the last, I think, major big look at Philadelphia's history, and got to thinking about what could we do next. And I will take the credit or the blame for planting the idea that maybe we should have a new encyclopedia of Philadelphia. And then our good friend and colleague Gary Nash helped to amplify that idea. But it really kicked into gear in 2009, and maybe this is where Howard might want to pick up the story with the civic planning workshop that he helped to get off the ground.
Well, I think that what Charlene's alluding to is the sense right from the beginning that this is going to be a little bit different than the standard encyclopedia. We had in mind New York and Chicago, which had big, fat books, wonderful products, which we were really impressed by. And we could even go back to 2008. I remember that specifically because Obama was running for president when 3 of us met in Chicago to meet with Jim Grossman, who had been the driving force behind the Chicago Encyclopedia. And we got his advice, we got his blessing, we went forward, we thought we were going to have a book, and as we started to talk to people and particularly to gather in, as it were, the ideas of our fellow historians across the region, particularly in Philadelphia, but across the region generally, we found it was going to be probably something other than a book, because the National Endowment in particular was not interested in books anymore. They wanted to see better access through web-based planning. So the process was reach out, get a model, change it to the new times, and then try to find your authors through a civic process of gathering in ideas and then trying to find the follow-up with people who will actually put pen to pencil, pen to paper.
Yeah, we were really in a process of continual reinvention as publishing was undergoing its digital transformation. So we did come to think of this as a digital first project from which we would curate things in a variety of forms. And these books are the biggest result of that. But over time, we have assisted with some exhibits. We've assisted with some historical societies, lent things to newsletters, helped people out with various projects. And to answer your question about how many topics, I think it's about 750 topics online from which we curated these 3 books.
So that actually leads to my next question, which is, how did you select which essays to include, and did you commission any new articles for this initiative?
Yeah. So we took some time and took several runs at figuring out what books we could produce, and really the project's evolution drove us, I think, to these themes. Howard, you were the first to conceive of the region book, so maybe you want to talk about your process for that.
We had a regional center before we had a regional encyclopedia, so it seemed like a nice match to bring the encyclopedia, which was originally at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, to Rutgers. Charlene followed very quickly thereafter to take over the job that I had created there in the Regional Humanities Center, so it was a good match. And I think that we felt that...
Howard, if you could just hold the microphone closer to you.
We thought that one of the ways that we could be a contributor would be to not merely tell the old stories, but particularly look at the ways in which the evolution of the major events and experiences of Philadelphia spread throughout the region and created something larger than what was normally talked about in traditional terms.
Yeah, so having conceived of a book that would be the region, within the digital product, we had produced a lot more. And so it was a matter of looking and seeing where did we have groupings of topics that made sense together, that allowed us to draw some conclusions and some analysis from. And so that led us to the nation. And once we had the nation, that leads naturally to the world. And then we worked on conceiving of the chapters that would support those 3 themes.
I had a selfish reason for asking. Since I was one of the authors included, I wanted to figure out like how high or low was the bar in the cut. I spent some time with the encyclopedia this week, and then took a look at the Greater Philadelphia volumes themselves, and I had the opportunity to reread that wonderful article in the March 2009 summer newsletter from which was especially the article by Gary Nash, as you mentioned, an informative experience. Did Nash's vision shape the online initiative?
Yeah, I think Gary brought, well, so much to the project. First of all, by amplifying it and putting it on the agenda of the historical community in Philadelphia, but then also by shaping this vision, which Howard alluded to, of the ingathering, that an encyclopedia in our time, he was wise enough to foresee, was going to draw in from the communities of Philadelphia and the region, and not simply be a matter of scholars or all of our graduate students that we drafted in to produce a list of topics, right, that we needed to listen and hear, and that's what he wrote about, I think, effectively in that newsletter. And we did start this overall process with a series of public programs, and some of you may have been at those programs, and if you were, I hope you recognize your input into the contents of these books. because we did take that as very seriously in building up from the content. And Michelle's essay on coffee houses is a great example of the decision-making process for these books. So coffee houses, Michelle can tell us more. And really, most of our topics, they don't clear-cut into this is local, this is national, this is global. I mean, really, most topics exist on all of those planes at the same time. And so there was some decision-making. And you read about coffee houses in Greater Philadelphia and the world, which is a book that's very much about movement. And so the coffee houses as a place where information moved, particularly in terms of the Atlantic world trade, is what led you into the Greater Philadelphia and the World volume.
I was wondering, because I do have a question later on. Well, before I do that, can I tell my Gary Nash story?
Please.
I'm not going to tell you about coffee houses. If you want to read about coffee houses, there's a wonderful book published by the University of Pennsylvania Press called Coffee Nation.
By
There's a
Michelle
whole-
McDonald.
By Michelle McDonald. There's a whole chapter on coffee houses. Here's my Gary Nash story. I'm going to truncate it. I'm from Southern California. I got my undergraduate degree at UCLA in history. And I never took a course with Gary Nash. I never met Gary Nash until I was here in Philadelphia as a graduate student on a postdoctoral fellowship. And in fact, it was a program that was being held here in this very building at Franklin Hall at APS. And I had just settled into the reception and was balancing my plate of food as one does, and had just received my first little glass of wine as a graduate student. You're very excited about the food and the wine at receptions. Do I have any graduate students in the audience? Please affirm, yes, please affirm this is the case. And so I was sitting there just preparing to enjoy my repast when a gentleman walks over to me and says, "Is the chair next to you taken?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Do you mind if I take it?" I said, "I don't, but first you have to get me a glass of wine." And he said, "I know." And he said, "Brazen." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because you just kicked over the one I had." So he looks at me for a moment, goes back to the bar, gets a glass of wine, comes and sits down next to me and says, "Hi, my name is Gary Nash." And I went, so that's how I met Gary Nash. He was a wonderful, wonderful human being and historian.
And I have to add one story to this in terms of this project, which is that I had sort of planted this encyclopedia idea with him. What I did not know, and what none of us knew, is that when he stood up at the 2007 event at the Historical Society, that he would just announce that we were doing an encyclopedia, that University of Pennsylvania Press would publish it, much to the surprise of the publisher who was in the room, and that I would edit it, much to my surprise. So that kind of put us on the hook for following through, and he continued to be a great friend of the project.
I'm really glad that he did, because now we have the 3 volumes to enjoy. And I was going to ask you a bit, to elaborate a bit about the structure, because that's one of the things I found interesting. These aren't strictly chronological volumes. They're really organized thematically. And so you move back and forth in time. And I'm wondering if that was always the structure you'd envisioned, or had you thought about alternate structures, doing a strictly chronological 3-volume history of Philadelphia?
Yeah, so I don't think we ever thought of a strictly chronological arrangement. These are very, I would say, organic. Howard, you can let me know if I have this correctly. The content sort of led us to the organization of these volumes. So the regional volume, which Howard co-edited with Carolyn Adams, is geographical and about connections. And so it has its own natural sort of order of things. The Greater Philadelphia and the Nation book, which I co-edited with Gene Sutherland, I think does have a little bit more of a chronological through line to it, because it does begin with the American Revolution topics, but then unfolds right through the broadening and challenges of creating a nation, and then opens up more into pathways of how Philadelphia connects with the nation. So the chronological part was easy, pretty much. That falls into place. but the opening out into things like communication networks and popular culture was a little bit of something that the content led us to. And I think similarly for Greater Philadelphia and the world, we have these big immigration essays, and this is edited by Andrew Heath, but generated through a number of editors, including Dominic Vitiello at University of Penn. We looked at our content to see where can we think about like the movements of people and ideas and things that connect Philadelphia with the world. And so, to my mind, the creation of the books was looking for topics that fit together. And when you had that group of 8 or 10 that fit together, then you have a chapter, right? And Howard, am I doing justice to the process as you remember it?
Well, I would add just one way of thinking about this. First of all, this is not an A to Z process. If it were, we would be just as fragmented as everything on the web. What we wanted to do is to stir connections, and by doing that, you think of things as a layered experience. So you talk about the American Revolution, you talk about the founding of the nation as we see the president and the Congress forming up in the early years of the new republic, but then you see it remembered, and you see it evolving, and you see shreds and pieces of it coming in other places. And this is what I think is going to lead into the coming year, when we're talking about everything but the effect of the revolution. We're going to go back and look at this thing as static. That's not where we should be. We should be talking about how the revolution and the institutions that followed created multiple experiences, and we're trying to give you some stimulation to think about connections. Then you can follow up from there.
Which I think is the enhancement part of this, in distinguishing the books from the digital product. The enhancement are the chapter essays that open each of these sections, where one of the editors looks through this and analyzes what we've learned and tries to pull that knowledge together, as well as the concluding sections for each, which is an explore more, that urges everyone to keep going, right? Not stop with us.
On their own.
Yeah, but keep going in your explorations of not only books and articles, but also archives and historic places, and other digital products that are going to remain available. Yeah.
Had you always intended this to be a semi-quincentennial publication? They both laughed, so there's a story behind that.
Yeah, well, in my preface to the book, I call it a happy coincidence. And what that means is it took us from 2009 until about a year and a half ago to amass enough content to begin to be able to envision books. And that's thanks to all the people, hundreds of people, who contributed to this project that brought us this far. So happy coincidence, and we're pleased to bring it out at this time.
It's a really excellent time for the volume to come out for all of the reasons that you and Howard have articulated. We're in a moment when eyes are going to be on Philadelphia. We're in a moment where we're going to be trying to situate what can sometimes seem like a singular event into a larger context, and these volumes do that in really wonderful and rich ways. So this is a difficult question. It's kind of like, this is the, do you have a favorite child question? You love them all the same, but differently. Would you be willing to offer an example or two of essays that really captured your attention, or that made you understand a topic in a new way?
So one that comes to mind is, for me, in the Greater Philadelphia and the World book, there's an essay in there about the Pacific world. So we often think about Philadelphia in terms of the Atlantic world. But that book opens up with 3 really big, rich essays: Atlantic world, the Americas, and the Pacific world. And that essay is by Lawrence Kessler, who I think probably some of you know, and his set the pattern for the others. I just think to think about Philadelphia in terms of its connections with the Pacific Ocean and the Pacific Rim, just really opens up your thinking about Philadelphia. And I'll also say there's a combination of topics that added to my insight about this region a great deal. And it begins with something that's in Howard's book. There's a map of Indian trails. And all of us who live around here know about roads that have names that came to us from the Lenape people. So in our project, I think for the first time from the scholarship that existed, we have a map that shows these trails on both sides of the Delaware River and really makes you aware of the extent of that network. And then as I had the opportunity to work on some essays about early roadways, which were great fun for me, I really gained a lot of insight into how much the geography and the infrastructure of the Lenape people created the geography and the infrastructure of our continuing region today. And I think about that a lot when I walk, when I drive, when I explore this region. So that was something that I really gained from this project.
Thank you, Charlene. Howard?
I'll go to the other extreme. I love your answer, by the way, and particularly that story about the Great Road, because, as I said the other night, it brought in Daniel Boone, who I didn't know was one of our regional captives.
Yeah, that's the Great Mountain Road.
Yeah.
I went to the Daniel Boone homestead, thank you very much, to
Well,
research that essay.
That was news to me. I'd even forgotten it was in the index that I poured myself into for the first book. A short essay on gas stations is worth looking at. Oh, yeah, we all know what gas stations look like. But remember, we're very early on. Remember, before we had gas stations, people were going to local shops to get cans of gas and putting it in their car and seeing all these things emerge over time. Gas stations had a big evolution in the way they were set up, the way they were used, and the way they looked. And one of my favorite pictures in the book is the Atlantic gas station in Lower Merion, now torn down, unfortunately. It looks like a Art Nouveau, beautiful building, which you can't imagine existing today. And on the other hand, some gas stations were created that looked like villas. One of them, which survived, is now in Fairmount Park. So there are some strange things you wouldn't expect to find in a essay that was just fit in with a transportation section, which would lead to all sorts of, wow, my God, I didn't know that. And if you didn't know that New Jersey is the only state in the country that requires that we not pump our own gas, then you also will have learned something.
This is true. This is true. Even if you want to, they won't let you pump your gas in South Jersey, which is actually one of the things that's striking about the book. So I have an individual question, one for each of you. Charlene, you do a wonderful job in your preface of exploring the term Greater Philadelphia. How has that term been used historically? And is that the same way that you're intending to use it in this project?
Yeah, so I love these projects that take me on dives in searching for the origins of words and phrases. So Greater Philadelphia was my challenge here because we had used this in our project almost from the beginning, but not really examined the record, right, for uses of Greater Philadelphia. So it is a phrase, so far as I can tell, that comes into being in the late 19th century. So this was a period of annexation for American cities. And in the time period around when Chicago had its great annexation, which was in 1889, right, Howard? And when the 5 boroughs consolidated into New York City, this phrase greater started to be used to describe these enlarged metropolitan areas. In Philadelphia, the phrase was latched onto by municipal office holders and people seeking the office of mayor or city council, to use it not just in a geographic sense, but in the sense of making the city greater, by which they meant making it more modern. So someone running for mayor who wanted to improve the ports, who wanted to improve the roads, might run on a campaign for Greater Philadelphia. And so it came into being in the late 19th century, but then it sort of bleeds over. So it is grasped by businesses in their advertising, right? That they are for Greater Philadelphia, or they're serving Greater Philadelphia in a business sense. By the middle of the 20th century, it is used by a lot of organizations around Philadelphia just to geographically identify themselves. But the big period of takeoff lines up with that period of annexation, and especially the spread of the electric streetcar lines that allowed the city to connect out. And there was not only Greater Philadelphia, there was Greater Camden, there was Greater Wilmington, and a lot of overlapping in terms of maybe a furniture store in Camden saying they were the best furniture store in Greater Philadelphia. It's kind of fascinating, I think, to see how that evolved. So it has at least two meanings, geographically and this sense of aspiration. In our project, I would say, Howard, and I think you would agree with me, that we're mostly thinking of it in the geographic sense, but not drawing a specific line around it, saying, this set of county boundaries constitutes Greater Philadelphia, that it's more of an evolutionary kind of process.
And that actually leads directly to the question that I had for you, Howard, which was your opening essay in Volume 1 was about regional history. And to me, when I first saw this, I thought, well, that makes sense. Greater Philadelphia, in this sense, is not just actually Philadelphia, but it includes South Jersey, it includes Delaware. You cast a fairly wide net. And I was wondering if that was part of your understanding of Greater Philadelphia.
Well, it is, but it isn't generally people's thinking. For some time, I'm an urban historian by background, and in the late 90s, people like Neil Pierce and others were talking about the future of the American experience, and that the most important and vital engine of the economy is the region. So there is a regional school of urban studies, but it isn't widely shared in experience. We have a lot of authors who we had to press to make it make their stories regional. But the argument is, I think, very, very compelling that if you're going to have an effective region, you have to know yourself. You have to know what's in the region, and you have to know the parts of the region. And Pierce and others, particularly active here in the late 90s with a supplement that appeared in the Enquirer about the future of Philadelphia, said that the future is very bright. But if you think about the actual day-to-day activities and the way we operate politically, we don't act regionally. We only serve regionally. We have a regional housing system, we have a regional employment system, we have a regional transportation system, one that's very precarious at the moment. And the argument has been, to make a region work, you have to have something in common. And what better to understand in common but our history? And that is one of the driving forces here, I think, for the coming year, is to say, as we think about our history, let's think about its legacy and how we can build on it for the future, for a more prosperous and more effective region where all the different parts really add up and serve. So there is not a narrowly political background here, but there is certainly a practical possibility to say, if we start to know each other better, we might, in fact, be able to achieve more in terms of our goals of more housing, more employment, better transportation.
Excellent. I want to shift gears for just a moment, because one of the most striking, to me, aspects of these volumes isn't just the essays that were written, but the really wonderfully, richly colored illustrations of these volumes. These are a treasure. most authors would be, well, I certainly was, extremely envious at the number of images that you have, the number of color images that you have. Someone's laughing, but yeah, right. There's a lot, if you've seen the volume. They're fantastic. They speak to me, as someone who also has a deep interest in material culture and visual culture, they speak to me as loudly as the words. So can you talk a bit about how you pulled together so many fascinating graphic images, photographs, other material objects to create such a richly textured story?
So like most things in our project, this happened in a variety of ways. So first, all appreciation to University of Pennsylvania Press. Our publisher, Mary Francis, is here, so thank you, Mary, for such beautiful books in terms of the design and the color and all of the illustrations. One aspect of our project has been to give students opportunities to assist in the publishing of the digital project. And part of their work has been to locate illustrations and to do research for captions. And so a fair number of the illustrations you find in this book were located by our excellent research and publishing assistants who have, many of them have gone on to do really good work in public humanities settings across the region, having gotten their start with this project. We were also lucky enough to have a managing editor who is also a skilled photographer. So I want to acknowledge that Don Groff is here, who has contributed some of his photographs, even more to the digital project, but also some to the book. And then we did additional research, and I know Howard did a lot of digging for some additional graphics for his volume.
I would just say that one of the most fun things about finishing up with the book was adding two of the already existing photographs that were online printed. And I wanted, in some instances, to identify things that we couldn't access earlier for one reason or another, but also to tell particular stories. And North Philadelphia is an example I've cited earlier at another meeting, where the Temple Archives, online archives, has provided some wonderful images of different parts of the city. And in this instance, I found an older immigrant couple living in Philadelphia and tending their tree in front of their house, probably around 1960 or so. And about a year or two later, a wonderful picture of a group of black children not too far away in front of houses that were looking pretty good, but were, according to the caption, slated for redevelopment in the near future. And in that story of those two photographs, it seemed to me the transition was being told on top of what was actually in print. And so those were images that didn't appear on the online, but were part of the book.
Mm-hmm. And I think overall, we're so fortunate to have such a rich archival community here, not only in terms of the things, but the people who have stewarded them over time, who helped us find really good things, who let us republish them in these books. We had such great cooperation, so all of the archivists in the room, we thank you so much for that. And we did do some looking for new things. Mm-hmm. I was looking for illustrations for the Revolution Remembered. The Free Library has a great collection that we had not tapped in the digital version, but I urge you to look for the picture of the concession stand at the Sesquicentennial, which is a really fun picture. And there was a picture of the Centennial, the interior of one of those buildings, that's just the richest photograph that I have ever seen, that I have not seen published elsewhere. So we'll have some of your greatest hits, I'm sure, but probably a lot of things that you haven't seen in other publications. So yeah, the illustrations were great fun, and we're so happy with how they turned out.
Yeah, they look amazing. They look really amazing. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you if you have questions or thoughts or suggestions. So I'm warning you in advance so you can gear up for the audience participation portion of this evening. So my question is, you have mentioned the Explore More sections, which I found fascinating, because they lead people who are interested scholars or really just interested members of the general public. But this is an interesting format. It is so visually rich. The essays are individually relatively short. The collections build on each other. But who is your audience for this book?
Who is the audience? So we've had several audiences in mind from the beginning. So one of those is, I always think of as the engaged information seeker, right? It used to be those of you who would have a question and you would go to the library to look it up. Now you're probably sitting in front of your TV with your iPad, in front of you and looking things up all the time. So I had in mind that. We also are really keen on making books useful for teachers and students. And we've been really pleased over these last few weeks to be doing teacher workshops for the Philadelphia School District. The press obtained funding from the Semi-Quincentennial Funder Collaborative to make these books available to schools and through the branch libraries of the city. And over the last month or so, the school teachers have been coming to classes with us and developing lesson plans on these topics. So I'm really thrilled to see that fanning out. We also had in mind policymakers that, if you're involved in decision making for this region, having this background should be useful in informing your work. And finally, the tourism industry. And one of our great partners has been the Association of Philadelphia Tour Guides. I see some in the room, and I'm a proud member as well. And so it gets used quite a lot among people who are guiding newcomers to Philadelphia. So those are the four audiences we've always identified, but Howard, I may not be hitting all that you think of.
One you forgot was the news business. And
Oh, right.
one of my teachers who was in my workshop said, "Oh, my husband uses the encyclopedia all the time," which is what we want to hear. Just one last word about this, and I think you'll recognize it very quickly. These essays have been edited to be readable. They're for the general public, but they're also at the highest level of academic work. They are peer-reviewed, and they're fact-checked. So you have a combination of something that is a respectable academic product, but it's accessible. And that's very unusual in our business. We hope it's a standard that we meet, and we look for your feedback to see if we've done it or not. But that's at least our goal.
Excellent. So now we do have a microphone that can make its way around the room. We do ask that you raise your hand so we can bring the microphone to you. This is being recorded, and we want to make certain that we can hear the answers and responses. So we'll start over here.
Thank you. So my question's a little ill-formed, so just bear with me. And it's primarily for Charlene, but you spoke a lot about the concept of Greater Philadelphia, and it was very illuminating, I thought. I grew up in Philadelphia, and then we moved to Montgomery County, which at the time we thought we were moving to the suburbs. But lately, I've discovered we moved to a collar county. And I'm wondering where this term collar county has come into play, and whether that's a synonym for a suburb, or whether there's some connotation of a more tightly linked, or perhaps loosely linked, concept to the city of Philadelphia. And also, are collar counties just on this side of the river, or is Camden a collar county and Burlington collar counties?
Yes, I think I want to defer to Howard on this question.
I don't know the answer to that. Carolyn Adams, my co-author, co-editor, would probably tell you the origin of the Collar County reference. But I think what's really stunning is that how closely related activities are in these counties, both sides of the river, to the city itself, and how distant the feelings are in some ways of the people who live in those areas from the city itself. There's a long-term story that nobody in Camden ever goes into the city of Philadelphia. That's not really true, but there is a distance. And that's why I think theorists and practitioners, urban planners, have such a hard time saying, you're all part of the same group, you know, you're using transportation systems that you're paying for, you're doing all these things, and yet the only thing that really brings us together, thank you, Don, for your photograph, is the sports world. We all gravitate to South Philadelphia, we are all together, we root for the Eagles or whoever we're doing, and somewhere the boundary ends and it's New York Giants, somewhere up north. And that's the region.
That's not part of Greater Philadelphia, though.
Well, the other thing that your question makes me think about is that the identities of these places shift over time as well. So what might be considered a suburb at one point, or a particular kind of suburb, a generation later has evolved into something else. And that perception of identity is also relative. I spent some time living in Chester County, although I've mostly been in Philadelphia. And in the planning board meetings, you know, there would be testimony and people would say things like, we don't want to become the next, you know, whatever, you know, inner suburb they didn't like. But then time would go by and now people are referring to something else, right, as being the bad example of the place they don't like. So that evolves over time. And in the region book, there is a great collection of essays about the different types of suburbs, as well as essays about each county. So there's a great opportunity to think through all of that. But now I'm going to go home and look up collar counties and see if I can figure out where that came from, like Greater Philadelphia. So thank you for asking that question.
Saw a few more hands. I think over here was next.
Mine's a quick question. Do the essays have bibliographies?
They do not have individual bibliographies. Each chapter has this collective explore more that highlights the key references you might go to next. And then if you want to dig more into the bibliography, you could go onto the digital site where there is more extensive related reading as well as related archives and related historic places for each essay. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
The Atwater Kent's collection was taken over by a certain group, I don't know where, but that group said, and it's connected to PIFA or Hamilton Hall, they were going to put a display and just on the walls or just on the floor to see some of this stuff. What came of that?
Yeah, so we're not directly connected with that project, although I think you're referring to the exhibit that they held at PAFA last year. So the collection is being stewarded by Drexel University, and that exhibit was a showcase of that material. And I know that plans are being made for additional exhibitions, especially next year. I think you'll see some other exhibitions in different places from that collection.
But I can understand why you asked the question. That exhibition also did very much take a look of Philadelphia over time in thematic ways, so it resonates very nicely.
Well, and it's another example of how the work of these books and the encyclopedia gets curated in other ways. Because at that point there was only the digital product was very much source material for the catalog that was written for that exhibit. You know, so the work magnifies. Yeah.
Okay. This is a question about, I think, historiography, whatever the term is that relates to the process of history, and I think that you two on my left, you are of a similar vintage to a similar vintage to me. I know that he is because he and I were in the same college class, and so now, what in the book would be, or the books, the three of them, what would be different if these had been written in 1960 or 1965?
Good question, John.
Do you want to start on that one?
John and I were Yale class 1964. It's significant because C. Van Woodward arrived at Yale in 1963, and the whole world changed with Woodward and Stanley Elkins and others who finally broke the hold of old historiography that said slavery was somehow benign. And the world really changed very quickly. And for me, even as a graduate student shortly thereafter, coming here to Philadelphia, having written about Philadelphia's political machine in a traditional way, suddenly the Pennsylvania historians were saying there's a new social history out there that also changed things radically. So what's different now, of course, is it's much more inclusive. It is more diverse in terms of incorporating more peoples, native, foreign-born, and black and white and other colors. And it's also much more informed by scholarship that's gone a long way. So we're not breaking new ground. We're incorporating what has happened over that period you've talked about, and it's been a big change.
Mm-hmm. And that's what we were recognizing in launching this project. We have that great 300-year history published in 1982, right, which had its origins in the 1960s. But there has been, 2 generations of scholarship produced since then that's given us so much more, I mean, for this region, particularly black history, but also women's history and metropolitan history, that we had a lot to build from, but also a lot to do, right? So that the works you see here do synthesize from existing scholarship, but in many cases also had to push forward from what was already there in order to achieve the scope and the depth that we were trying to achieve.
I have my question is related to what you've just been discussing. It's a marvelous achievement, these 3 volumes, but it strikes me that the volumes almost become obsolete upon publication because it'll inspire somebody else to say, well, you didn't think about this, or I've been studying that. So my question is whether you've built in anything in this project to respond to that dynamism over time.
Yeah. So I think that's the best possible thing that could happen. You know, this is sort of us putting a pin in what we know, right? And laying it out so that the next generation of readers and questioners can carry it forward. And this is exactly what John, right, was mentioning in terms of historiography, that it's always moving. So we want that to happen. And I'll say, since we didn't talk about it in the Q&A, that the Digital Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia is an ongoing, thriving project. So these questions can continue to be answered. And I want to acknowledge our successors at March who are here, the director, Jillian Sayre, and the current managing editor of the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia is Isabel Stephen. And if you would like to help build the next phase of the Encyclopedia of Greater Philadelphia, please make sure you see them this evening. They've got great plans ahead, especially in terms of natural environment, environmental issues, faith communities and nationality communities are some of the areas they hope to add more to in the encyclopedia. And while I'm acknowledging people, I want to make sure we acknowledge any other contributors to the books or the website who are in the room. Would you just like to stand up so we can give a round of applause to you, authors, editors? Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
So you just anticipated I have it here as my last question. What happens next?
I wanted to make
Will
sure
the
we got to it.
Encyclopedia of Philadelphia continue to grow? Our future volumes in the offing? So I think you have anticipated my question. But I encourage all of you who have interest in the greater Philadelphia really broadly understood and beautifully illustrated, to take a look at the 3 volumes in the back of the room. And in the meantime, I would like to thank Charlene and Howard for joining me on stage today, and all of you for joining us at the APS this evening. Thank you so much for coming.